I'm Nathan Gita.
And I'm Aaron Ekman.
From BC's northern capital.
Welcome to the Ram and Stag Show. Now, Ross is a unique politician, to say the least. Contrary to what one might assume, he's pro-development, pro-pipeline, and in particular, pro-LNG. Ross views the Federal Indian Act as more irrelevant than oppressive, and he disputes interpretations of the 1997 Delgamuukw decision, which elevate the territorial authority of hereditary chiefs over that of elected band councils, restricting jurisdiction of the latter to reserve land only. And he regards UNDRIP as not only unnecessary, but inferior to previous agreements reached locally between many nations in northern British Columbia and the Crown. Perhaps most controversially, Ross has described reconciliation as mostly theatrical, regarding it to have been largely accomplished through previous land and title negotiations. Ross is additionally unique in that he managed his first 2017 win in what had been considered a BC NDP stronghold. In the same year, his party lost government. Despite his BC NDP opponent polling more votes than his party had traditionally needed to win, Ross held the riding convincingly again in the 2020 election, while watching his own party go on to suffer a significant reduction in seats in the legislature. So he's demonstrated he can win in enemy territory, and he's established it wasn't just a fluke by reconfirming that win under even more difficult provincial circumstances. But does Ellis Ross have a chance at winning the party leadership, or is he simply playing the old game of raising his own personal profile in hopes of a senior cabinet post down the road? Well, while no one can ever truly rule out the latter motivation entirely, it's my firm belief that writing Ross out would indeed be a mistake. Kevin Falcon, who hasn't officially confirmed his candidacy, but whom many consider the presumptive frontrunner, is likely the preferred opponent of the governing BC NDP, given the amount of baggage they appear to think may be assigned to him. For now, at least, Todd Stone has ruled out his own entry, possibly owing to some acknowledgement of his own baggage, the likes of which appears lost on Falcon. This leaves only relative unknown Tom Shipka from the East Kootenays, Kelowna newcomer Renee Merrifield, and another former leadership contender, Michael Lee. It's difficult to view the Shipka campaign as much beyond profile building. But judging from the mud thrown at Merrifield recently, the BC NDP at least see her both as a threat and a potential possibility. I always thought, and indeed said, that Michael Lee was the best the Liberals could hope to field in the 2017 election, given that he's smart, articulate, Chinese, for those who cast their vote based on the shade of another's epidermis, and experienced, but having held no senior cabinet post, carries virtually no political baggage. But all of these potential candidates lack two vital features displayed prominently by Ellis Ross. First, an ability to bridge the growing divide within the BC Liberal Party, and second, a genuinely populist bent. On the first point, the BC Liberal Party has always been a tenuous coalition of Socreds and Liberals, held loosely together by the same mutual hatred of the socialist hordes that drove the provincial Conservatives and Liberals into a formal coalition back in 1952. The expulsion of Laurie Throness from the BC Liberal fold in the middle of the 2020 election, a man widely regarded as an articulate, if not controversial, voice of the party's sizable social conservative wing, demonstrated the degree to which liberal identitarianism has infiltrated and established influence over the party leadership. Surely, some have already canceled their membership over the schism, but undoubtedly the prospect of a new leader has caused most social conservatives to wait and see whether this coalition still has the capacity to speak for them. Whereas BC has no shortage of smaller conservative parties to which disaffected social conservatives might flee, liberal identitarians, on the other hand, under the BC Liberal tent, really have only the equally unpalatable options of the BC NDP and the Green Party to entertain. With this in mind, and considering that objectively speaking, no candidate aside from Ross can be seen to have the minerals or the cultural fortitude to stand up to the kind of liberal identitarianism that social conservatives loathe, on the second hand, despite the age-old case against populism from liberal politicians and media alike, British Columbians decidedly favor populist leaders. And we always have. As we're fond of pointing out on this show, just because British Columbians lack a coherent and unified cultural identity certainly doesn't mean we don't respond favorably to leaders who most passionately articulate a course for our future. The story of Ellis Ross is one that most British Columbians, I think, will find interesting. A man who describes himself as having light skin and green eyes, being treated as non-native while on reserve growing up, suddenly found himself regarded as a representative of First Nations people off reserve, ultimately getting elected as chief counselor of the Haisla Nation and participating in what he describes today as fruitful and meaningful negotiations with the Crown that will go on to benefit generations of Haisla people. Today, he articulates a clear and confident pro-development vision for British Columbia, and by chance of birth, he should check enough boxes to satisfy liberal identitarians who would otherwise disqualify Falcon and Shipka. And yet, quite ironically, if at the first leadership debate, the question is asked, as leader, would you have expelled Laurie Thronis? It's conceivable that Ross might be the only candidate to answer in the negative. And that, right there, is why I think, despite Ross's difficulties in surmounting the electoral machine of Falcon and other better resource candidates, Ellis Ross is the BC Liberals' best hope of holding their electoral coalition together.
I wholeheartedly agree.
Then I've convinced you.
There it is, and that's the end of the show. No, it's funny, right? I mean, out of the possible candidates and out of who we have to choose from here, all I know is that for those of us on the right, especially those of us who have become more populist over the years, it would be tiresome to have yet another BC Liberal candidate from the Lower Mainland, on top of the fact that they're probably a donor to both of the major federal parties, both the Cons and the Grits. You know, it'd just be another waste of time. We're getting ignored as it is up here in the North. We're getting ignored as it is when it comes to our social problems and social problems throughout the province. Let's make no mistake. Obviously, the opioid epidemic is happening in the Lower Mainland as well. We're tired of feeling ignored. And so given how many seats now the BC Liberals have that aren't in the Lower Mainland, thanks to the recent orange wave that happened, and yes, they need to fight to take back some of those suburban ridings, which is, again, going to turn into the same thing in the federal level, where Tories are always trying to fight for the, what is it called, the 305 or whatever in Toronto. The point being that we need to take territory again if we want to win again and whatever. And I don't know why I'm saying we, because me and the BC Liberals don't exactly get along. But at least on the right, there are definitely some compromises maybe need to be made. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that this is a mostly rural party now, at least for where the elected representatives are. And on top of that, it is that part of BC that slowly but surely felt more and more ignored by the leadership of the BC Liberals. That's got to be fixed. Soft issues need to be sold where they need to be sold, no question. At the same time, the fact of the matter is that the backbone of the party and the backbone of all right-of-center parties in British Columbia has started at the headwaters of the Fraser and the other major rivers that are in the north of the province and flow down. And I believe the Socreds used that analogy several times to great effect.
The one name I didn't mention, I guess, in the opening here was Aaron Gunn. And he's an interesting character, I think, to watch as well, and will be interesting to watch. He's widely speculated as being interested. He's made some posts on social media to that effect. He's sort of waiting for a groundswell of support, I think, which is how many candidates try to fabricate their entry into a race. And others have said before, and quite rightly, that his challenge, I think, will be, despite him having a comparatively sizable social media following, transferring all of those followers into party cards and then voters and supporters. So we'll see if he's able to do that. But I think there's probably problems with him as a candidate in the current context of the BC Liberal Party that are separate from just his social media following and the question of whether he can transfer that into a base of support. When you look at why he has a base of support, like what is it that he's been producing? It's mainly grievances against other groups in British Columbia, predominantly in Victoria, because that's where he is. Now, having sort of casually watched him over the past couple of years, assuming that he was on this trajectory or trying to put himself on this trajectory, it's clear that he's been able to travel across the province under what guise, I'm not entirely sure. But he recognizes that he needs to get out of Victoria, but that's a huge problem. He doesn't have a seat, even if he became leader. And where's he going to run? Victoria? I mean, Victoria is not a stronghold anymore for the Liberal Party, and that's probably one of the most difficult places to get a seat. So I think that's going to dog him if he does come out. But he's the only other candidate other than Ross that sort of fits the populist bill, I think. And it's absolutely true. If you just look at previous candidates in the history of this province, the ones that have been successful, even going back before W.A.C. Bennett, right back to Amor to Cosmos, it's always been kind of wacky,
Very
but
wacky.
definitely populist leaders that British Columbians identify with for whatever reason.
There's that high Tory tradition too. If you go back to our first governor, Douglas. It was funny, right? Because there's like while he was actually of humble roots when he became governor and everything else, right? He had to take on the role of that. And it was interesting because while he didn't enfranchise people the same way that you would have thought of in a very kind of, post-Enlightenment liberal motif, he did honor his word, or at least he tried to, with the agreements he made with First Nations people. And it was one of those big reversals where you had liberal democracy in the form of Amor de Cosmos come in, and he he didn't want to honor the agreements with the First Nations. So it's one of these funny things. Ironically, it actually seems like I think First Nations have a better legacy of making deals with actually conservative movements than they do with social democratic or more liberal ones. Certainly it's been the case in BC.
Well, in Amor de Cosmos, of course, there's that famous cartoon that I think was published in the Times Colonist way back when, or maybe not, because maybe that was the paper he had founded actually. But in one of the papers of the time, this picture of him escorting by the scruff of the neck a Chinese man out of the province, and that was not meant to be ironic or satirical. That was essentially the task he embarked upon.
And he was the progressive.
At the time, yeah. And so was Judge Begbie. I mean, comparative to other judges at the time, but let's tear down a statue anyway.
So, but coming back to the question of Ellis Ross, I think that what we see there is, again, perhaps finally a made in BC sort of moment. If one of the things I think is really interesting about First Nations in both British Columbia but also in Canada is that where is that sense of belonging and where is that sense of ownership? Let's say for a moment that the mosaic motif that came to us from 1967 onwards, out of the Pearson-Trudeau consensus, let's pretend for a moment that makes any sense at all. Even if it did, the argument would be that then, in a sense, as various backgrounds, ethnicities, classes, and creeds come into acceptance of the multicultural system and reach the hierarchy, begin to climb their way through the hierarchy of that system, because make no mistake, multiculturalism and all identitarianism creates hierarchies, right? The thing is that you would think that the first place at the table, as kind of, the post hyper conservative reactionary religious but still majority white population is in charge, which is what Pearson and Trudeau represented. What we'd assume is that like the first people at the table would have been the First Nations, but it's taken a long time for them to get to the table, and and they've been dismissed many times. I mean, for goodness sakes, Justice Minister from British Columbia dismissed by Trudeau and his cabinet, Trudeau the second to be clear, and dismissed like forthwithly and like in very misogynistic terms, as well as some terms that bordered on racism, and nobody made any wheels about it at all. Like that was it. And it's like, this is wrong. Like, I mean, if we're going to play this game of there being hierarchies, then shouldn't it come, again, in ever concentric circles of like, well, first, maybe the people who have always felt that they had a stake in this country, but have always felt that they don't have a stake in the way that it's being governed, maybe they should have a say first, or at least be near the front of the line. But no, they've been routinely ignored, and maybe that's what needs to change, and that's what can be changed if Ellis Ross becomes the leader of the BC Liberal Party.
Well, and it's interesting to conceive of him as premier as well. I can't think of another premier, and hopefully somebody can correct me, who came from that part of the province. And certainly he'd be I mean, technically the first First Nations, first premier of British Columbia First Nations descent that I'm aware of. And it wouldn't be a surprise to me, actually, that he came from the right of center party. It tends to be that, I don't know what it is, but this is probably something that angers a number of progressives. But all of those hallmarks, those markings, those achievements, those firsts tend to be accomplished by right of center parties or conservative parties. So the first woman prime minister of Britain, of course, was
Margaret
conservative.
Thatcher, yeah.
The first Canadian prime minister was technically a Tory, even though she was just there for a little while. The first woman premier in British Columbia did not come from the left of center party. So it's interesting that those hallmarks, those milestones are not always, or even mostly, achieved by the so-called Progressive Party. But his candidacy, Ellis Ross's candidacy, I think, is more exciting for a number of other reasons, to me anyway. And it is what he articulates in terms of his vision for the future of the province of British Columbia and how he sees the different disparate groups within it. It's quite interesting listening to him talk about it. I certainly don't agree with all of his positioning on a number of international trade issues, for instance. I do like that he focuses on international trade. I don't know really how you win an election in British Columbia without focusing on international trade.
We don't trade with anybody.
Yeah, right. You
No.
know, I mean, it really, and it's not just British Columbia where it is the secret, as far as I'm concerned, to Trump's success. And if we were to analyze his defeat this time, despite all of the noise, I think it really came down to an inability on his part to keep that message going, to continue to relate to people on matters of international trade, employment, et cetera, that really is what impacts them the most. I think he diverted from that message that he had been so consistent on back in 2016 for understandable reasons. He's not a guy that's got a huge focus of attention, and he's like a crow. He follows the shiniest story. But similarities in that along that bent are displayed, I think, by a candidate like Ellis Ross, who talks on issues to do with LNG, et cetera, the export. But most importantly, he's focused on who benefits primarily from these projects. But he's got some very controversial issues on a number of big questions, like his interpretation of the Delgamuukw decision. I think is he's in the minority on that, certainly within First Nations communities, but probably within the legal community at large. But that's not to say that he's.
I would actually counter by saying he's in the minority of the narrative. The
Sure.
narrative, the overarching meta narrative is Delgamuukw was this great way of moving forward, and it's what started us down the road of having recognition of oral tradition and that cultural appropriation needed to stop. That was the burgeoning of it, and that we were going to have people be raised in their own communities, and it's been an absolute disaster. It's been a complete disaster. If you are a First Nations young person or outright child, right, and you're in a bad situation in your family, and then now the state is imposing new rules on who can adopt you or who can foster you and everything else, it's been a disaster. It's been an absolute disaster, and he's absolutely right to oppose it. I completely oppose it as a First Nations person, and not unlike Mr. Ross, I have also been called out by my own side. I've been called all sorts of things, like a red apple and God knows what else, because I simply assert that, no, there is a way forward for us as First Nations people, just as Mr. Ross does. He asserts this, and it is not identitarian, grievance-based, and victimology. That is not going to pay the way. And by the way, when the white man is no longer the majority population, the white guilt trick isn't going to work anymore. And I think Mr. Ross recognizes that too and understands that we got to make deals now while there's still someone in charge who feels that guilt maybe. Because guess what? The upcoming generations, especially those who have no sense of belonging to those things, and have no historical connection to it. They're from a more recent, even if they are white, whatever that means, because that covers, sometimes it seems, a third of the globe. The point is that they don't have a direct connection to anybody who was here at the time when all those things happened. So it doesn't matter. So at some point, you have to make your deal when you can, and you have to move forward. And the victimology game is not going to work, and that card is going to cash out very soon.
I think he definitely would agree with that, and I think he talks about that a lot. In terms of that decision in particular, I'm just talking about his interpretation of seeing no evidence in the language of it that band council's authority is restricted to reserve, whereas the hereditary chiefs have retained jurisdiction over everything outside of the reserve. He just point blank says, I don't read that out of the decision, where I think the majority of the legal community does read that out of the decision. So that's interesting. I'm not necessarily sure that's going to be an unpopular position for him to take, even within various First Nations communities, at least within the northwest of the province. It certainly hasn't been a stumbling block for him so far. And there's enough, the most recent focal point of this has been Wet'suwet'en disputes and the Coastal Link gas line. And I think there's enough people within band councils of Wet'suwet'en territory, within the nations within Wet'suwet'en territory, who probably agree with him on that point. And so he's not necessarily trying to drive this wedge any deeper between the hereditary leadership and the band councils. He's just saying, yeah, maybe the band councils were created by the Indian Act and imposed upon many bands by the colonial power. But he says, I go through the records of my own of the Haisla Nation going back years. We petitioned to be part of the Indian Act. It wasn't imposed upon us. Now, I can't really counter him on that. I'm not a historian. I don't have access to the same records, obviously, that he's had access to. But I do suspect that there was no other option at the time.
It's the only game in town.
It's the only game in town. It's either you're in the, you either get a band council a portion to you, and then you get access to federal funds, or nothing. You just sort of cease to exist. So it's quite possible in my mind that might have been the context at the time. But hard for me to argue with a former Haisla council chief. But the point is, here's a guy that lives in the here and now who's saying, not opposed to the Indian Act. Well, that's, as far as I'm concerned, pretty heretical.
It's deeply heretical
within that milieu.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah. So whether that causes him any difficulty within what might be seen as his core base of support or not is yet to be seen. I don't think it will, because I think that tension is very real within band councils vis-a-vis hereditary leadership, and so he probably is well aware of that support base, and maybe views those support structures within, because there's a whole layer of politician within band councils that also have their own machines as well, and if they jump on board with them, I mean, can probably produce some votes.
I think something that's important to note here is that, like, even though it's still very far out for where the leadership race is going, I think when it comes to what's going on with the BC Liberals is that they have, we talk about identity on this show all the time. We talk about British Columbian identity on this show all the time. And the thing is that I would argue that this too is another point of concern, that the leading right-wing party in the province, as much as it grieves me to say those words, I am no fan of the BC Liberals and where their direction has been in the last couple of years. But the fact of the matter is that leading party, it needs to be a strong opposition, and that's exactly what went wrong in the last election. They had no good ideas. They had a weak leader, smart as he is, weak in the eyes of the voter, and weak in the eyes of his opposition. Horgan creamed him debate, creamed him everywhere. So the point is that if that's where we being like all of us on the right, and then the one kind of champion party that we have to be on the right in BC, which again I'm not super happy about. But the fact of the matter is, if that's where we were, then where are we going? And it's like, well, we have this made in BC option. Don't just go for quote unquote electability. That's consultants lying to you. Like, consultants are paid, and they're paid to tell us that, well, Falcon and some other people are the most electable. It's like, well, actually, no, not necessarily. It's who you put your vote in the ballot box for that gets elected, and who can show leadership and who can show vision for the province. I believe Ellis has the ability to give us that vision, and to give a leader persona to the question of not just what is British Columbia, at least from that perspective, but also a made in British Columbia stance, because he's from here, and he had to get where he is by his own two hands.
Well, it'd be interesting to see if there's an influx of sort of professionalized staff or communication staff into his campaign, at which point I don't see evidence that there's a huge machine there. I think that's going to be his biggest stumbling block right out of the gate. But if you start to see people coming in there, there's going to have to be at some point this real tension between what they think, the style that they think he should employ versus what his real style is, because he's pretty rough. Like, you see him on TV. We saw him debating another First Nations leader from back east over
Ryerson University.
Yeah, I can't remember her name. Pam something.
Palmetto.
Yeah, something like that. Anyway, I think she's well known back east, and he just sort of loses his cool and which makes, like, it's nothing that I find offensive, and I don't think the average British Columbian probably just thinks, yeah, I mean, that's the way we talk. But communications professionals, it would probably terrify them to see him, because they'll think he's gaffe prone and all that kind of thing. But again, we live in this post-Trump era where, I mean, do gaffes really exist anymore? Well, I guess if you were a BC Liberal and you were watching what happened in Abbotsford in 2020, you would say, yes, gaffes absolutely do exist. But I'm not sure that Laurie Thronis lost that because of what he said. I think he lost it because he got turf from the fold, and
a bunch of angry people stayed home on election day.
And I mean, there are people that were not going to vote for a candidate who wasn't the BC Liberal candidate, but they also weren't going to vote for the BC Liberal candidate. So anyway, the point is, I think
he didn't lose by 10,000 votes. Like, let's be clear about that. It was narrow.
In fact, I was surprised to see him lose. I thought he was still going to take it because I thought his base was pretty well insulated. But again, I think the most fascinating development that could take place and I know they won't do it, but if there was at the first leadership debate for the BC Liberal candidates, once they all come out of the woodwork, if the question was, would you have turfed Laurie Thronis? I mean, I would just love for that question to be asked, because it's the one question that best reflects, based on the answer, who's going to be able to hold this tenuous coalition together.
Absolutely.
Like I said in the opening piece, there is a sizable historical, social, conservative wing within the party that's always been there. That comes out. It's that original merger of the Socreds and basically the federal Liberals. And they're not. Some of them have probably thrown up their hands and said that's enough of these guys after what happened. Many of them are probably saying, "Well, I'm just going to wait around to see who the next leader is going to be." But there's places for those people to go. Now, they're fringe parties. They're not mainstream parties. But the Socreds didn't even have a leader when they first got elected in 1952. How fringe were they? And so it's not inconceivable that there could be a resurgence of the BC Conservatives. If there was a provincial component of the People's Party or something like that, there's a place for them to go. What people don't realize is there's really no place for the Liberal identitarians within the BC Liberal tent to go. Where are they going to go? There's no Liberal Party to go to. They could go to the BC NDP. In fact, most of them probably should. That's because they're not really that far off of each other on the big issues. Some of them could go to the Green Party, I suppose, and maybe some of them would. But other than that, I mean, they've been demonizing those two parties for so long. How do they go there? And so, when it comes down to who's the candidate that can best hold these groups together, I think it's the one that can stand up to the one that is the most aggressive at this point, which is the Liberal identitarians, rather than the social conservatives who actually have a place to go. So I honestly, when I say that the only one who would answer that question to the negative, and we don't know unless it's actually asked, which it probably wouldn't be, the only one that could answer it to the negative is Ellis Ross. And he would probably be able to describe the importance of keeping that coalition together to keep the so-called socialist hordes at bay. Everybody else, I think, Michael Lee included, probably Michael Lee predominantly, would be good in an election, but under the same circumstances, I think would allow the same thing to happen. They wouldn't get behind the candidate. They wouldn't try to articulate the nuance behind those positions. However much I might have disagreed with what Laurie Throna said, I think tactically it was a disastrous error on their part. Not wholly responsible for them losing the election, but played a big role and exposed the divisions that are becoming more tenuous within the party. So I think in terms of unity, Ellis Ross is undoubtedly their best bet.
I think that it's not just though about unity; it's also about progress, and progress in the sense of how are we going to get here? How are we going to take where we are right now? It is a divided province. It's a divided nation. It's divided regions for that matter, as Ellis Ross can attest, and that's the flip side of this. I see in Mr. Ross a potential leader who can give vision, clarity, coherence, and then a path towards for that a better British Columbia. I really see that, and that's why I would be happy to see his candidacy move forward, and hopefully he would take the leadership. I'm not saying there won't be challenges. I'm not saying it won't be difficult. I'm not saying there aren't going to be gaps, but I like this guy. I like how he fights, and hopefully that's who can steer British Columbia into a proper understanding of where the 21st century is taking us.
Well, that's well said and a good place to leave it. I'm really looking forward to your opening position, which is up next.